the gatekeeping of your value across borders, across the physical border of your country, is more of an African challenge. And we're not really telling the African story of Bitcoin from this perspective. So most of the resources, the tools, the books that we're reading to learn about Bitcoin are not written with our reality and our culture in mind. And so because that is the case, our educators, our orange pillars are still mostly going to sell a foreign story to African young people. And African young people will not engage with this technology if the story that is being told about technology is not their story, it's somebody else's story. So yes, it is possible for the younger generation to be Bitcoin first, for the younger African generation to be Bitcoin first. But what's going to be the precursor to that will be a telling of the Bitcoin story in the African way, in relation to the real challenges and the real issues that Africans combat day to day.
Welcome to the Bitcoin Source, your essential podcast for all things Bitcoin. I'm Dawdu, your host for today's episode. We're thrilled to have with us Femi Longe, former program director for B Trust Builders and now currently global Bitcoin lead at Human Rights Foundation. Femi has been instrumental in educating developers in Africa about Bitcoin, and today we'll dive into some of the societal issues, economic imperialism, and the role Bitcoin can play in reshaping global finance. Let's get into it. So, Femi, I want to thank you for joining us today. Obviously, what drew you personally to the world of Bitcoin? Was there any specific moment or event that made you realize its importance, especially in the African context?
Yeah, I mean, thanks a million. Great to be here. Um, I'd known about Bitcoin for a long time. Well, I knew there was something called Bitcoin. But I don't think I really took the time to actually study it until a time late in 2021, I think now, when I was approached to help some guys find someone to run a new program they were launching for Bitcoin educators, Bitcoin developers, called Kala. So it was a program that was going to train African Bitcoin software engineers about Bitcoin development and get them into a job in Bitcoin. And they were looking for a director of operations. So they reached out to me, purportedly to help them find someone to run it. When they reached out, I think first I'd known about Bitcoin, but I never knew about the engineering side of Bitcoin. And so that was the first time I was hearing anything about the engineering side of Bitcoin and that there were opportunities there. So I said, okay, this looks interesting. Let me try and understand it more so I can know who in my network I can recommend for the role. And that actually took me then down the rabbit hole. As we say in Bitcoin, I went to check out a few blogs, um, went to download the Bitcoin standard, started reading it, never finished it. But I think halfway through the book, I started to see the bigger picture. I'd only known Bitcoin as this cryptocurrency that people buy, the price goes up, you make money. I started to see that the picture was different, the picture was bigger. There's a bigger game at play around money, and its role in development, which is never really talked about that much. Um, there's bigger conversations around just generally beyond African and developed world, conversation about how money is just broken generally. And I started to see that the philosophy, the thinking behind why Bitcoin was created, um, was showed some promise as a potential tool that we could use. I've always been passionate about African development. I think I built my career working on solving problems around Africa and trying to improve quality of life for people in Africa. So I guess for me, as I started to study Bitcoin, I realized this was a tool that could be used for that same fight. And it made sense for me to find a way to be part of that fight. And so I went back to those folks and said, "Hey, what if I actually ran the operations of this organization for you?" and we agreed terms. I started running that, which was Scala, which ended up becoming Beach Trust Builders. And as they say, the rest is history.
Nice. I know you're currently the global Bitcoin lead at the Human Rights Foundation, leading the strategy behind the Bitcoin Development Fund. Could you tell us more about the purpose of the fund and how it helps promote financial freedom? How did you transition from your work at B Trust Builders to your current role at the Human Rights Foundation?
So the Human Rights Foundation, I think, um, is one of the biggest funders in the Bitcoin space. For the last 5 years, the Bitcoin Development Fund has been investing in software engineers, Bitcoin educators, Bitcoin community builders, UX designers, people improving Bitcoin at every layer, from Bitcoin core through to the applications, and increasingly Bitcoin adjacent freedom technology. I think for the Human Rights Foundation, it's the biggest one biggest non-profit that works with human rights activists, civil rights defenders, dissidents working in oppressive regimes and human authoritarian regimes across the world, trying to hold governments accountable.
Yeah.
And if you understand, if you've ever lived in, when I was in university, I passed through. I lived in Nigeria at a time when we were under military occupation, and one of the first things that repressive authoritarian governments do when they try to stifle opposition is to go after their money, whether it is to freeze your bank account or to block your donations or to seize your assets, or in the in or at I mean at the final, if they try every other means and they can't get you, they go after your life. And occasionally you have activists who have to flee the country with everything that they have, all their entire assets. And but at the same time, we're also conscious that when they're doing the work, um, their donors, the people who donate to them, are a source of leverage or pressure from the governments. Governments want to know who's supporting them so that they can go after them and pressure them. Their families are in the targets as well, and so they need the ability to be able to carry out their operations, do their work with money that is censorship resistant, money that you don't have to go through the formal banking system. They need to be able to, in the event where they've had to flee into exile, they need to be able to control their operations, pay their staff, pay their sources. And so the Human Rights Foundation, through the Bitcoin Development Fund, has been supporting technologies that are working to make sure Bitcoin retains those properties. Bitcoin stays private. Bitcoin stays censorship resistant. Bitcoin stays resilient to attacks. But Bitcoin also is usable. Bitcoin is built in a way that takes into consideration the nuances of how people all across the world consume technology. And we build something that is not just for, build applications that are not just for Bitcoiners, but they are for real human beings, real people on the streets that are fighting authoritarian governments. And so we've had that fund for the last 5 years, or going to 5 years. It's going to be 5 years in Q2 next year. We've been giving grants quarterly. I think our last batch we gave 10 Bitcoin of grants a couple of weeks ago to 20 projects. So we're constantly giving, and we give not just to those who are building Bitcoin Core, Lightning, application projects, mining projects, through to people who are on the ground in developing countries, building circular economies, running Bitcoin education, translating Bitcoin applications into local languages. For us, Bitcoin needs to work. It needs to be strong. It needs to be resilient as a freedom tech, but it also needs to be useful. And my role at the HRF is to see how we can expand and deepen the kind of work that we do with that fund. Um, I've I've been friends with the HRF for a bit. At Kala, they were one of our main funders at Kala, which I ran. And at the point where when I felt I needed to transition my work beyond just educating developers to supporting more real concrete adoption work within the Bitcoin space, we had a conversation about the role, and I'm really, really happy to be in there.
I'm really happy for you in this role as well. of course, I've been following you for so long. Whether it's you, Charlene Federico, Abu Bakari, there's just so many Africans in the space that I really look up to. And Africa has been been stereotyped as this continent that is solely dependent on foreign aid. At the Oslo Freedom Forum, you discussed how Bitcoin can challenge that narrative. How do you see Bitcoin empowering Africa to reshape its economic image on the global stage?
So I don't see, um, to be clear, I see Bitcoin as a tool. I see human beings using Bitcoin to accomplish whatever outcome they want. I think a key outcome for us as Africans, or for me as an African, is one, to see how I can improve quality of life for my people, and two, to ensure that we have the opportunity to deal with the rest of the world with respect and dignity, which is something that I think has been sorely lacking in our engagement with the world. We're that continent that everybody feels like they have to give to. And in many ways, we've also internalized that, so that we feel comfortable begging. And for me, that act itself it sucks away your agency, it sucks away dignity. And so what I see our possibility and our potential for Africans who are working with Bitcoin, who are using that tool. I see it's an opportunity for us to, in this new space, establish our engagement as value creators, as contributors, as opposed to the people that they give to. Um, for years, for decades, we've been crying trade, not aid. But part of what's not been said are what the barriers are that stifle our ability to trade as freely as people from the rest of the world. Whether it is trade tariffs, whether it is visa restrictions, whether it is high cost of travel, whether it is our fragmented currencies across the continent, whether it is those borders that the Westerners created that we haven't been able to mentally and physically transcend to trade first effectively amongst ourselves and then with the rest of the world. You have all these barriers that we need, and we here, being Africans, we need to be very intentional in dismantling those barriers. And for some of those barriers, Bitcoin gives us an opportunity. Bitcoin gives us an opportunity to be able to send value, receive value from anyone, anywhere in the world without relying on an archaic banking system that, in its design, is designed to gatekeep us out of a system. That helps us transact value transcending the 45 odd currencies that we have in our continent. That means that if me in Nigeria wants to trade with somebody in Ghana or in Togo, I'm more likely going to denominate that trade in the United States dollars, which is not a neutral currency. With Bitcoin, we have the opportunity to denominate such engagements in currency that is not controlled by any other country, which means they don't have that currency as a political leverage and a tool to make sure that our internal policies favor their own interests. So I see Bitcoin as a tool that we can use to restore dignity for our people, to improve quality of life for our people, to stimulate more international trade within ourselves and with the rest of the world, and for us to be able to also get value back for the contribution that we're bringing to the world. And however, it's all of that doesn't just happen. We need to be intentional. We need to have strategy, and we need to back it with action to use the tool to achieve the outcome we want.
Yeah, Femi, this is why I'm proud to have this conversation because my podcast, a lot of people will see this, a lot of Africans will see this, and I think that outside of these conversations, you don't see a lot of conversation being brought about what's going on in Africa. Of course, you have the Africa Bitcoin conference, but for example, my generation being a younger generation, when I talk to my grandfather or my grandmother or even my dad, they always talk about these external powers and the institutions in Africa that are corrupt and are kind of stopping the inflow of information, stopping the inflow of Bitcoin getting to the masses, and even as far as electricity, I talked to Nolene Sumba about this in Kenya, and I know this is an issue in Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, other places. But there's a lot of blackouts. There's a lot of times where if you're mining, of course, you can use solar, but you have these issues where if you don't have a generator in certain rural areas of Africa, you're kind of out of luck as far as getting internet access, having electricity. Um, is there any developers in your space that are working on building something in regards to electricity and Bitcoin in Africa? And could you talk about some of those initiative projects, if there are any, that are poised to make an impact on the continent in that regard?
I mean, if we talk about electricity, there are a few things to know. So one, there are parts of Africa where you don't really have a generation problem. You actually have a transmission and distribution problem. So to put that in context, usually where you would site a typical, maybe you're creating a hydropower plant. You're probably going to site it, if it's run of the river, you're going to find a good spot on a river, which is most likely going to be a rural area where you're going to site that plant. Or otherwise, if it's a dam, like a major dam, again, it's going to be far from the urban areas. So you have all these megawatts of electricity that's being generated at those dams or at those sites. It could be geothermal, it could be whatever kind of source. But you need to transmit, first using high tension cables, the electricity from those rural sites to the city, which is hundreds of kilometers away. And then you need a system to then distribute from where it lands in the city into people's households. So a big chunk of our problem as far as electrification in the continent is concerned is that transmission and distribution. There's still much we can do around generation, but transmission and distribution is where a lot of the problem is. Now, in many countries, governments decided to privatize generation. So you have all these people who've invested in building those plants. But those plants are there and they're operating at below capacity. There's certain countries, I've heard recently where if you can't demonstrate that you have 80% usage of the plant, you might as well not turn it on. And the thing about a lot of those energy types is, if you're generating 1,000 megawatts, even if only 100 megawatts is being used, you're still generating 1,000 megawatts every day. So 900 megawatts is being generated and it's not being used. So where projects like Gridless come is they act as the buyer of last resort. So they come to that plant owner and, hey, we'll buy 900 of you. And if demand increases, if suddenly the general public need 200, then they'll switch off some of their miners and they will only take 800. And so it then makes the economics of creating those plants work. In terms of developers building in that space, there are African developers that are starting to build solutions in the broader Bitcoin space, not necessarily in the mining space. There are developers outside Africa that are building things around decentralizing mining. But in the African context, I'm not sure that those are the biggest problems. That's the biggest problem that we have to work towards. I think the bigger challenges that we need to work on are what are the quality of life issues that challenges that Africans face that relate to money, and how do we use technology as a way to solve that? That broad thesis is what has led to the growth of fintechs in the continent. So if you look at funding for startups in Africa over the last 7 years, the majority of it has gone towards fintechs, because there's a fundamental problem as relates to both money as well as just financial transactions, getting value, sending value. So you have startups that are building solutions that help small businesses with working capital loans, because we don't have a credit system. You have startups that help you embed payments easily into any kind of solution you have, or embed payment into social media which you're using to trade or transact. Bitcoin and Bitcoiners are starting to work on solutions. A number of solutions I know right now are looking at the cross-border payment challenge. So you have Mava Pay in Nigeria that allows you send a lightning payment. So you send a Bitcoin payment to a lightning address, and instantly your bank account in Nigeria, your fiat bank account, is credited with the equivalent.
Yeah.
You have Bitsako. You have Bitsako in Kenya. That's helping. That's taking an age-old cultural phenomenon in many African countries called group saving. In Nigeria, we call it Esusu. In Kenya, they call it SACCOs. In some parts of Africa, they call it chamas. Giving people the opportunity to actually do group contribution, group savings powered by Bitcoin, which is also a way for people to actually get into group buying of Bitcoin, group hodling of Bitcoin, and group using of Bitcoin as a savings technology. You have Tando in Kenya that's making it very easy for people to actually spend their Bitcoin and with retailers that accept M-Pesa, which is mobile money in Kenya. You have Splice in Kenya that's helping businesses that want to do cross-border payments in Africa to do it seamlessly using Bitcoin and stable coins on Bitcoin. So you have people who are starting to look at real African challenges. I think you have. Well, I didn't even mention any of the OGs. You have Machankura in South Africa that's making sure that you don't need internet access to be able to actually buy and sell Bitcoin. You have Bitnob that has been the oldest Bitcoin exchange or one of the oldest Bitcoin exchanges in Nigeria that's helping people do everything from Bitcoin to M-Pesa, Bitcoin to Momo across multiple countries in Africa. So we have all these people, and it's a new phenomenon that I'm hoping to see only more of. People who are looking at uniquely African problems, uniquely African issues, looking at the key features that Bitcoin has, looking at things that makes Bitcoin tick as technology, and then recombining them to build solutions that are Africa first, but that show the power and the utility of Bitcoin as technology and as a currency.
There was a couple of things you said there. One being Manchankora. There's a lot of youth in Africa, and I think that no matter where you go, no matter what country you go to in Africa, you always see someone with a mobile cell phone, a mobile application. Even if they don't have money, they always have a cell phone. And the median age is around 20 in the continent. Can this younger generation of Africans use Bitcoin and other technologies to leapfrog some of the traditional financial hurdles that we see? And I know that Kala is really helping people develop and formulate these think tanks of smart engineers that are going to push that forward. But Femi, I wanted to ask you, like, do you see the younger generation kind of taking this mobile application in Nigeria, in Lagos, and saying, okay, I'm not going to use a traditional bank, or I'm not going to use the CBDC that they have, and I'm just going to strictly use Bitcoin for my day-to-day purchases?
Yes, that's possible, but there's work that needs to be done to make that happen.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, I think the core work that needs to be done to make that happen is for us to actually start telling the African narrative of Bitcoin. I think a lot of the stories, a lot of the definition of what Bitcoin is, a lot of the thought leadership, a lot of this, what is written about what Bitcoin is, right now, still comes with a Western slant, still comes from a Western perspective, still comes with the reality of Western societies in mind. Western societies don't really have a money moving challenge, a currency, a value transfer challenge. Yes, they have challenges around money storage and inflation over time, like we all do. But even that is to a lesser degree than in Africa. The gatekeeping of your value across borders, across the physical border of your country, is more of an African challenge. And we're not really telling the African story of Bitcoin from this perspective. So most of the resources, the tools, the books that we're reading to learn about Bitcoin are not written with our reality and our culture in mind. And so because that is the case, our educators, our orange pillars are still mostly going to sell a foreign story to African young people. And African young people will not engage with this technology if the story that is being told about technology is not their story, it's somebody else's story. So yes, it is possible for the younger generation to be Bitcoin first, for the younger African generation to be Bitcoin first. But what's going to be the precursor to that will be a telling of the Bitcoin story in the African way, in relation to the real challenges and the real issues that Africans combat day to day. And the other thing that would also make that happen would be for people to build utility tools that plug into the average day of the average African, that gives them an opportunity to either earn or spend Bitcoin. I think there's one of the fundamental flaws right now in the way we engage Bitcoin in the Bitcoin space is this perspective and the assumption that your primary way to get Bitcoin is to buy it with fiat. I think if the primary way to get your Bitcoin is to buy it with fiat, then the people who have more fiat currency end up owning more Bitcoin. And if the primary way you're getting your Bitcoin is by buying it with fiat, then a part of your mind is anchored to the price of Bitcoin in fiat on the day you bought your Bitcoin. We need to move, starting in the African continent, to a stage where, and a situation where the primary way for people to get Bitcoin is to earn it, just in the exact same way they earn their fiat. Because my fundamental belief is that if you earn your Bitcoin, you're less concerned about the price of Bitcoin to fiat. Because one Satoshi is one Satoshi is one Satoshi. You only think about Bitcoin price to fiat because you're earning fiat and you're converting your fiat to Bitcoin. And then you're converting your Bitcoin back to fiat because you still spend on things that meet your everyday needs in fiat. In a Bitcoin denominated world, which I think Africa can lead on, we have a million and one ways that people can earn their daily living in Bitcoin directly. And as you create those opportunities for people to earn in Bitcoin, you're simultaneously creating opportunities for people to spend in Bitcoin. Because the person that is earning for delivering a service, and that service might as well be denominated in Bitcoin, which eliminates the need to convert your Bitcoin to fiat and removes that whole conversation about volatility, which is one of the big distraction topics in Bitcoin that I think we can help lead the way in transcending the African continent.
Yeah, I love that. I think that makes total sense. And um, in the West in particular, you can earn Bitcoin by working a job, but of course there's more overhead regulation, right? So you're dealing with taxable events, you're dealing with exchanging from one cryptocurrency to another. There's a lot of different rules that Africa doesn't have, which is a good thing. And I see that, when you look at external powers, right? Like a lot of people see the potential in Africa more than sometimes Africans do. And the Africans that do see that potential, they're running with that and they're using that to the best of their ability. But like, for example, you have a lot of people coming from China, coming into Africa, building infrastructure, offering money. And I've always told myself that Africans don't need external funding. They can do all of these things on their own. They don't need other innovators to come in and say this is how Africa should look, or this is how the technology in Africa could look. Do you think that kind of development will change the way that Bitcoin is used as a dynamic in the country? So, like for example, Femi, to make this clear for you, I'm always curious to know about what you think the future outlook of Africa will be.
As far as outlook, I'm a firm believer that the best way to predict the future is to create it.
Yep.
The outlook is only tied to what we create intentionally. We need to understand that the beneficiaries from the existing system will fight tooth and nail to keep the existing system as de facto. They have no reason to want to change status quo because they're the beneficiaries in the status quo. So they are going to use every form of leverage that they have on our policymakers in Africa to make sure policy doesn't favor this technology. Similarly,
Yeah.
again, and it's also part of why I'm conscious and cautious about the language we use in the Bitcoin ecosystem, a lot of which mirrors libertarian ideology, which may not necessarily track in our continent and can end up being what alienates us from actually creating the systems that actually makes this thing thrive in our country. When Bitcoiners in Africa are saying, oh, we don't need government, down with government, governments should die, we're replacing governments, we forget the fact that governments are still a fundamental part of how our societies are structured. They are influential players in the society. And rather than fighting them, we should actually be doing the work of getting them to understand how this technology benefits them and both the outcomes that they want for the citizens as well as um, their own them personally. Unfortunately, you do that, you have those kind of engagements when you come not with an antagonistic viewpoint, which is what you get a lot from a lot of the Western libertarians. And a lot of Africans just echo that approach without critically understanding what does this mean in my own environment and my own dynamics. I don't believe African governments, I believe African governments stand a lot to benefit if they understood Bitcoin and they understood what it could do for them as a society. Just like we're seeing in El Salvador and in Argentina, in parts. In parts. They have their own problematic sides too, but in parts. But you don't get them to engage with this technology if you don't engage them. You don't get them to engage with it if your first instinct is to tell them that they suck. And so we need more maturity in the African Bitcoin ecosystem, doing the work of critically bringing key stakeholders on the side of this technology, helping the people working on Africa's climate agenda, people working on electricity generation in Africa and electrification of Africa, people working on foreign trade and inter-African trade, getting them to understand what this technology is, what makes it tick. People working on bringing in more foreign direct investment into Africa's creative sectors to understand what this technology is and why it makes sense for them to be on board with it. When we bring them on board with us, when we get them to understand this, then we'll start seeing African countries that will make this technology a key part of their agenda. Again, also understanding that nature abhors a vacuum. If we're not there having those conversations with them, then we leave space for shitcoiners to be there having conversations with them, like we saw in Central African Republic and with the Songo coin. If we're not there
Yeah.
having rational conversation like adults with empirical data with them, we leave space for the IMF and the World Bank to influence their thoughts, influence their perspective, influence their thinking, and cause them to go around deranged and wrong policies like CBDCs. But that would require, all of what I'm saying requires intentional action led by grown-ups. And so if we want the outlook that's positive for Africa as it relates to Bitcoin, it's only going to come from Africans actually taking the reins and doing the work to make those outcomes happen.
If you had to be in a place where you were really motivating the African continent and developers in particular, what advice would you give to a young developer who is excited about Bitcoin right now and how they want to be a part of this global financial shift?
So the beauty of Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is built open source. Bitcoin is built and a whole chunk, a whole universe of technology has been built on Bitcoin that is open source. So like the DNA of Bitcoin, the technology, it runs on proof of work. Similarly, for any young developer that wants to come in this space, they need to build proof of work. And the easiest way to build proof of work is to take the skills that they already have, find an open source project in Bitcoin, and there's a whole universe of open source projects in Bitcoin, and start contributing to them. Find a place where your skill, if you're a front end engineer, find a project that you can contribute to. If you're a back end engineer, find a project that you can contribute to. That would always be my first advice, because the more you contribute, the more you do, the more you learn, and as you learn, you grow, and you build consistency, and you have the opportunity to actually establish yourself as both a thought leader and a critical doer, and Bitcoin is constantly in the search for those.
Femi, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the Bitcoin Source, and I definitely learned a lot about Africa. I mean, of course, I'm tuned in because I have family there. I have a lot of friends in the space that are African, but your
Yeah.
perspective on this is very important, and I'm so happy that the audience is going to be able to hear this. So, your roles in reshaping Africa is going to be huge. I'm super excited for you. I can't wait to see what else you do with HRF. And I just wanted to thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you for the invitation. Really great to be here.
Yes. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us for more in depth conversations about Bitcoin and its global impact.